The lesson this morning is a little bit different from what we have been doing. We just finished our series on Second Peter. We've had a lot of interest. So, by faith and fear and trembling, next week we're going to dive into the book of Revelation. There's so much in there. So, I would encourage you, starting this week, start reading the book of Revelation, okay? Because we're going to have lessons out of Revelation. So this is kind of a in-between sermon, but for me, I wanted to share with you something that I believe is really basic to understanding who Jesus is as we try to live out our Christian life. Here's a note about the potluck today. We're going to say goodbye to David and Paula. So as soon as we're over here through with our assembly and feasting around the Lord's table with communion, we get to go back there and feast again. We're going to talk about the compassion of Jesus. And if you have your Bibles, turn to Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45. And this will be our lesson text for today. And I've been doing lots of reading and study and reflecting on compassion. And it just seems that it is so crucial to our living out the Christian life. We talked this morning, we were in Galatians, but Paul says the one thing that counts is faith expressing itself in love. And I thought, boy, that really connects with compassion, doesn't it? That when we express compassion, that is faith expressing itself. So I want to read Mark chapter 1, if you want to follow along, verses 40 through 45. A man with leprosy came to him and begged on his knees, "If you're willing, you can make me clean." Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. "See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for you and your cleansing as a testimony to them." Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. If you read, I think it's the King James Version and also the English Standard Version, verse 41 starts off, instead of Jesus being indignant, it's Jesus moved with pity. Like, now that's a big difference, isn't it? Okay. The idea here is that on the one hand, Jesus wishes that those that are around him and even the leper would understand his ability to respond to human needs, but that he's also moved with compassion and he responds to that. Here's the fascinating thing, though, about Jesus and his ministry. I suppose, and Philip Yancey makes this point about the Jesus I never knew in his video in his book, I suppose one day Jesus could have gone out on the hillside of Palestine one morning and just with the wave of the hand said, "Okay, everybody with leprosy, you're healed." It doesn't look like he did that. And so one of the miracles that we find about Jesus and his ministry is what we might call the miracle of restraint. He doesn't heal everybody. But on occasions, when he meets individuals who have these deep needs, especially, and we're going to say this in a minute and emphasize it, especially the people that fell into the group called the untouchables. A leper was both physically and socially an untouchable. And Jesus does the unthinkable. He goes to the leper, touches him, and we're going to see how important this is, not only physically, but touches his life. And he responds to his need and he heals him. So the compassion of Jesus draws a leper. And I want you to think about leprosy in ancient times. As you know, there were leper colonies. People didn't have the medical wherewithal and all the medical science behind it to deal with it. So in order to deal with it, because you were so fearful of it, you put them off in colonies. And we know throughout history there were certain people who were Christians that felt called to minister to those colonies filled with lepers. Some themselves contracted leprosy as they were ministering, which is really an amazing thing to think about. But leprosy in ancient times, once you got it, you had it. And so you were often shoved off to the edge of society. This story is one of the greatest examples of compassion in the New Testament. In my mind, probably goes alongside the Good Samaritan, because Jesus is going to an untouchable. And what I find in Jesus is a perfect blend, and I think we need to hear this because of our times today. Jesus is the perfect blend between conviction and compassion. The perfect blend. Sometimes Christianity has opted for one or the other. I want you to think about this. Conviction with no compassion, what does that look like? And compassion with no conviction, what does that look like? Okay. It takes both of them. And we see Jesus here responding to this human need. And he has that perfect blend of conviction with compassion. You might ask the question, why is this so important? Why is compassion so important? Well, think of a world without it. Can you imagine? Now, the world's bad enough the way it is. And sometimes it seems like it's getting worse. But I can't imagine the world without the presence of Christianity with all of its expressions of compassion. That's why in many, many, many communities all throughout our nation, you will find hospitals called the Good Samaritan Hospital. Well, think about why they've played off of that out of the New Testament. Ultimate compassion for someone who couldn't help themselves. And so it's interesting too. I don't want to get off on a side note here, but this is fascinating. Church historians and Christian sociologists have done research and published through the years all of the noticeable positive impacts on culture and society because Christianity is present. And I think we take that for granted. Many hospitals come from Christians who established them. Many works of relief. And you can just go on and on and on and list all the different things that have come up through the years, all because Christian people had compassion, they saw a need, and they responded to it. Okay? The leper comes to Jesus and implores. Notice that he kneels down. If you will, can you make me clean? So apparently, some kind of reputation about Jesus had preceded his coming, so that the leper knew, he may not have known everything, but he knew enough that Jesus is where I need to go. And I almost get the idea he made a beeline for him. He knew something about Jesus. Let's use that today in our own sharing of the gospel story. You know, there are a lot of people all across this good nation of ours, they know something about Jesus, but that's about it. Don't know a whole lot. And those of us who believe that we have faith in Jesus, Jesus is living in us, and all the wonderful expressions you can use, it is up to us to live such a life. And I'm going to hammer on this today because I think this is so important. We have to live the kind of life that is attractive to others so that makes them want to come to Jesus. Because otherwise, if you don't, guess what's happening? You're going to be living the kind of life that's going to repel people from Jesus. And you certainly don't want that. So his reputation preceded him. And he knelt in humble submission. When we come to Jesus and we want to experience his compassion, we must come to him in humility. That's how we come to know Jesus. That's how our hearts can receive him. to come to him in humble submission. As we think about this leper, then, he has this expression of belief. If you will, you can make me clean. That was an expression of belief. He's not sure exactly how it's all going to happen, but Lord, if you will, I know you can make me clean. So he had gotten to that particular point. This is significant when we talk about compassion. I've often thought, think about how in World War II and all of the death camps and people that have died, and in wars since then, if the world had been filled with compassionate people, there would have been no wars. What if we named our church, of course we call it the Church of Christ, I wonder if it would make any difference for our public image and our mission, and even understanding our own mission as a church, if we called our church the Church of the Compassionate Christ. Instead of Church of Christ, out on the sign, it says the Church of the Compassionate Christ. I think what would happen is people go, wow, wonder what that group of people's like. The Church of the Compassionate Christ. Well, that's what it's all about. Is Christ living in us, recreating us to be compassionate people. So let's look at further about this feature of Jesus' ministry and his compassion. In Mark chapter 6, verse 34, Jesus came to the crowd. He felt compassion for them because they were like shepherd, or they were like sheep without a shepherd. Have we ever, and I can remember the first time seriously studying through the Gospel of Mark and asking my question and asking myself, and I didn't come up with a very good answer, but the question is, have I ever looked at just people in general that I come in contact with and kind of across the board, and I know that they're not Christians, do I have the compassion for them like a shepherd would for lost sheep? Do I have that deep inner compassion that longs for people to know Jesus, that agonizes because people don't know Jesus? So this is very important for us as we think about our own ministries. In Mark 8:2, it also says, Jesus said, I feel compassion for the people. And he did. Every day when he interacted with the crowds, he had this deep compassion for every human need that he could see that was being brought to them. And in Mark 9:22, we have a situation where someone comes to Jesus and said, Jesus, can you do anything? Take pity on us and help. Well, this leper understood that. He knew that Jesus would listen to his plea. When we think about the compassion of Jesus with this leper, I can't imagine living the life of the leper typical in Jesus' day. Can you? Being put out on the edge of society. I'm sure that your family wouldn't do a whole lot with you. Maybe, I remember seeing one movie, it was supposed to be kind of back in those days, that there was a family who had a family member that was in the leper colony. And what they would do every day, they would come and bring food and some other things, maybe new clothes, but they would set them down at the edge of the camp and then go back home. So it was like untouchable. We can't deal with them. Well, here's what this story enables us to see. Do we care for what society today would identify as the untouchables? Do we care enough for those individuals like Jesus did? That's the tough question of the Christian life, isn't it? And I've got a couple examples I'll share with you in just a minute. The leper knew he'd be clean. And he knew Jesus could do it. We don't know what stories he heard ahead of time. He just knew that he could ask Jesus. And to have a compassionate heart like Jesus means that we are tuned to and we're willing to listen when people cry out for help. Think of how often people who have crying needs that others turn a deaf ear. In living out the Christian faith, we cannot turn a deaf ear. We have to have an ear attuned to people who are struggling. Notice that the people in Mark 1, it says they were coming from all over. And they kept on coming. So once word got out where Jesus was, guess what? The crowd just flowed in, and everybody had all these needs, and they wanted Jesus. And it made me think about this. I'm going to throw out a statement that's pretty strong. I believe compassion draws people like a magnet. Think about it. Think of a person in your life that at the right moment, they responded to your need as an expression of compassion and care for you. You've never forgotten that. Compassion draws people like a magnet. The second thing about this story is that Jesus himself is moved by compassion. This situation impacted Jesus, and it makes us ask the question then about our motivation. What is it that moves us to compassion? And I want to give you an example, and this is telling on me, and Nancy can chime in afterward if she wants to. We've gotten to where, have you ever seen those advertisements on TV about the poor little dogs that need somebody to adopt them? Well, they're playing on your emotion. They're trying to move you to compassion. Well, in that situation, we finally got to where we've turned our ear away from. We don't really listen to it. Poor pitiful animals looking there. And we've not responded to that. Well, is it a legitimate call for help? Could be. But it's so easy, if you're not careful and you're not interested, to tune out calls for help and calls for compassion, isn't it? It's too easy to do that. So what we want is, like Jesus, to be moved by compassion. Is there a difference then between empathy and compassion? Well, one word, empathy, comes from the Latin, or comes from the Greek. Compassion comes from the Latin, and basically they're the same meaning, but in English they don't quite mean the same, at least how we use it. If I say I have empathy for a person, you know that I'm talking about I have feelings for that situation, okay? I'm not quite sure in our English usage that empathy means, okay, I'm going to take the next step and do something. I don't think we think about that. Usually when we think about empathy, it's just with feelings, okay? Compassion, though, I think we use that word to take it one step further. We have the feelings of empathy, but compassion has feelings that motivate us to do something. And that's kind of how we use it, although literally they mean the same thing. I want to share with you a story of an 11-year-old girl that was moved to compassion. I thought this was so cool, and I want to share it with you. It's a story of an 11-year-old girl named Ruby Kate. And a few years ago, she made national news because of this. And Ruby Kate began going with her mother to visit residents at a nursing home. And I think it was every Sunday afternoon, they would go visit. And she also assisted patients at actually 5 different nursing homes over time, because she started having a business where she would reach out and help them. Well, Ruby Kate noticed one day, she went into a room, and I'm trying to remember what the lady's name was. Oh, it was Pearl. She went into Pearl's room, and she noticed that Pearl was just sitting in her chair looking really sad and staring out the window. And she thought, well, I wonder what's wrong with Pearl. She's just staring straight out the window. So Ruby Kate went up to the window and looked out. Somebody was taking Pearl's little dog away because Pearl didn't have the money for the food to feed her little puppy dog. And that broke Ruby Kate's heart. So she began and started that day. I thought this was cool. She took a pad of paper and she went in to all the residents of that particular nursing home. And she said, if you could have a wish, 3 wishes, what would it be? So she started writing those down. And she said, you would think it would be like, well, I want to get out of here. I want to end up going on a trip over to Europe, or, some great big old wishes that people would want. But she said instead, she found it was simple wishes. Like, I need a new pair of slacks that fit. I need a new pair of slippers. I need a little bit of food for my pet dog. Just little things. And as a result of that, I think it's later that week, she went on and created what's called a GoFundMe account. Some of you may know about the GoFundMe account. And within a couple of months, $26,000 had been raised. And she started a little ministry herself, being able to go into individual residents in the nursing home, little things that they needed out of that fund, she began to provide for them. So here's an 11-year-old understanding that you need to listen long enough to find out what people feel like they need and then to respond to it. I thought, wow, what a great example of someone being moved to compassion and doing something. So compassion of Jesus, he's moved by it. And is there any difference between empathy and compassion? I think there is, the way we look at it. And I think that Ruby Kate, this 11, and this is actually a picture, doesn't show up too, well, it's okay. I thought it was going to be darker than that. But this is Ruby Kate sitting in the room with Pearl. So what a great example for us to think about. The compassion of Jesus changes people. I want you to notice one of the things that's really important, and Mark really makes a lot of this. And I don't have time this morning, but there are, let's see, 4, 8, there's at least 8 passages in the Gospel of Mark where that Mark goes out of his way through the Spirit to identify where Jesus actually touches people. He touches people. Now, there's a willingness on Jesus to step out and step forth when others made excuses and wouldn't do anything. And think about, for Jesus, it was an appropriate touch. I mean, we live in a society where you're afraid to touch anybody for any reason, and I know that. But the idea of a physical touch, putting your hand on their arm or their shoulder, and we've all had that. We're in a moment of despair, or somebody come up and give us a hug, touch us. And in addition to that, thinking about how Jesus' life then today touches people, touches their heart. We even use this expression, don't we? Oh, my granddaughter did this or said this and it touched my heart. We say that, don't we? When people do things, it touches our heart. Well, there's a reason for it. The compassion of Jesus, he reached out and that appropriate touch. So, and I've mentioned the touch in Mark's gospel is so crucial about understanding his involvement intentionally in people's lives. One thing we need to note, though, compassion is not self-promoting. Notice that it was the healed man that spread the word. What we don't find Jesus doing, which I see, unfortunately, I have seen through the years, a lot of televangelists that make their whole ministry about healing, there's a lot of self-promotion going on there. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus does not become involved in self-promotion. What we can say is he lets the act itself speak for itself. That's what he does. And he will respond to situations where compassion is needed. But he doesn't go ahead and splash it on the Jerusalem Times on Sunday morning paper so that, oh, guess what? I'm the Messiah and look at all the healing I did today. No, he doesn't do that. Okay? He just lets the act of compassion speak for itself. So Jesus didn't spread the word, the person did. Now, compassion is what we might call altruistic. In other words, we engage in compassion for compassion's sake. We don't do it for ourselves. We don't do it to make the headlines. We don't do it to promote ourselves. We do it because it's the right thing to do, because we are trying to be like Jesus. Okay? And then the last thing I want to share quickly is compassion is fearless. It moves the fearful clinging to one's life to a fearlessness that moves out into others' lives. And we need to hear that. That's a powerful statement, because if you're not careful, we all can get wrapped up in a fearful clinging to our own life and what our needs are, and it's all about me. Compassion helps us get out of ourselves and serve God by serving others. This fearless life is not competitive. I'm not going to come to church on Sunday morning and say, Larry, how many compassionate deeds did you do last week? And if you said, well, I did 10. Well, guess what? I did 11, so I beat you. I mean, no. Compassion is not competitive. We're not going to do that. We're not even going to get caught up into that. It allows us, though, to walk into the sufferings of others. We resist this kind of, don't we? I remember the very first time I did this, it was hard. A friend of mine had had colon surgery 3 or 4 different times that went wrong. And he was in a lot of pain. And I went to visit him. And I remember sitting there one day, and he told me, he said, I'm suffering so badly, I can't even pray. I said, well, I'll tell you what. Let me take your suffering upon me, and I'll pray for you. And he gave me this look of like astonishment and total relief, and just let me pray. And so I kind of walked with this young man for several months before he moved away, but going and visiting him once a week and praying with him, but trying to enter into his world of suffering. It was hard for me because I didn't like to see him groaning and suffering. But guess what? Compassion walks into the suffering of others, and we have to be intentional about that. It's filled with an intensity of caring that cannot sleep. We care so much we can't go to sleep, as it were. It's an intensity that we care so deeply that we cannot fail in the job itself. And it's a fearless self-emptying of ourselves because we're full of Christ. I'm not full of me. I don't want to be full of me. I want to be full of Christ so I can respond to you. And compassion is a fearless joining of hands and hearts in the community of faith, the church. When we see ourselves as the church of the compassionate Christ, then I think we're on the road to being the people that God wants us to be. If you need to respond this morning to the invitation, I love the hymn, because if you look at the hymn, number 425, where could I go? Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that the leper, when he had this deep need, there was only one place he could go, and he knew who that was. And so today, when we ask the same question, no matter what our situation, whether we need salvation to come to Jesus, whether it's life issues or problems we don't know how to solve, I mean, you just name it. Where could I go? There's only one place to go. So if you need to respond to this question in the invitation this morning, and we can help you in your journey to come to Jesus,